And the fog ghost. The cattle car doors slid open with the screech of rusted metal against metal, and Senior Sergeant Alexei Volkov's first breath of Finnish air carried the scent of pine resin and wood smoke. 3 weeks had passed since that October morning in the Karelian forest, when the fog had swallowed his patrol whole, when his Mosin-Nagant had spoken its last word before German voices surrounded them in the mist. Now shackled and exhausted, he stumbled onto the platform at Stalag 326, somewhere north of Helsinki. The Arctic tern feather, his white feather, was gone, lost in the chaos of capture. But the memory of its weight beneath his helmet remained, a phantom reminder of the 18 months when he had been Der Nebelgeist, the fog ghost who could shoot what he couldn't see. That skill felt useless now, surrounded by watchtowers and barbed wire stretching toward the horizon. "Move along, Russians." Quickly now. The guard's voice was surprisingly gentle, almost apologetic. Volkov had expected brutality, the savage treatment Soviet propaganda had promised him he'd face in fascist hands. Instead, the Finnish soldiers seemed tired, their faces bearing the same war-weary lines he'd seen on his own men near Lake Onega. One guard, barely older than Private Petrov, helped an elderly prisoner who'd stumbled on the wooden steps. The barracks smelled of disinfectant and freshly cut timber. Clean straw covered the floor. Through the windows, Volkov glimpsed something that stopped him cold. Prisoners playing chess near the fence, guards watching without interference. A Red Cross truck was parked by the administrative building, its white cross gleaming in the pale northern sun. "This isn't right," whispered Sergeant Dmitry Komarov, the political officer who'd been captured with Volkov's remnant patrol. "They're trying to weaken us, make us forget who we are." But Volkov was listening to different sounds. From the camp kitchen came the aroma of actual bread, not the sawdust substitute they'd eaten during the siege of Leningrad, but real rye bread with seeds and crust. His stomach betrayed him with an involuntary rumble. The intake process was methodical rather than cruel. Finnish clerks recorded names, ranks, and next of kin with bureaucratic precision. When Volkov's turn came, the clerk looked up from his papers with curious eyes. "Senior Sergeant Volkov? You are the sniper from the Karelian front?" Volkov's muscles tensed. His reputation had preceded him here. "I am a soldier of the Red Army." "Of course, but we have heard stories. They say you could shoot through fog thick as wool. Is this true?" The question hung in the air like morning mist over Lake Onega. For 18 months, Volkov had been a ghost in the forest, striking from invisibility. Now he felt exposed, studied, as if these Finns were trying to understand something beyond military tactics. That night, lying on his thin but clean mattress, Volkov stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he'd been taught with what he was seeing. Where were the torture chambers? The starvation rations? The systematic brutality that justified everything he'd done in the fog? Outside, snow began to fall on the camp, each flake visible in the searchlight beams. In the distance, he could hear guards speaking quietly in Finnish, their voices carrying the same homesick undertones he'd heard from his own men during long winter watches. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How can a man's certainty survive when his enemies insist on remaining human? The routine at Stalag 326 began before dawn with the distant sound of the Mosin-Nagant's bolt, not his own rifle, lost in capture, but the phantom echo that still haunted Volkov's dreams. He would wake, reaching for the familiar wooden stock, his fingers finding only empty air and the regulation wool blanket that the Finns had provided. 3 days into his captivity, the sound of that imaginary bolt action had become his unwelcome alarm clock. Roll call proceeded with Finnish efficiency. Guards counted prisoners with the same methodical care Volkov had once used to calculate wind drift and bullet drop in the forests near Medvezhegorsk. No brutality, no screaming orders, just quiet competence that made his skin crawl. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to behave. "They're trying to break us with kindness," Sergeant Komarov muttered as they marched to the work detail. "Stalin warned us about this. Make us soft, make us grateful, make us forget our duty." The work assignment came as another shock. Forestry detail, cutting timber for camp construction. Not slave labor in munitions factories, not brutal stone breaking or road building under armed guard. Instead, supervised tree cutting in the very type of pine forest where Volkov had perfected his cold aim technique. The irony felt deliberate. Guard Corporal Matti Järvinen oversaw their detail with the weary competence of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of pre-war farm work, he carried his rifle like a burden rather than a weapon. When Volkov asked for permission to examine a fallen pine, checking its grain for potential rifle stock material, an old hunter's habit, Järvinen simply nodded. "You understand wood," he said in careful Russian. "My father was a carpenter before the war." The admission hung between them like morning fog. Personal information from an enemy guard violated every assumption Volkov had carried into captivity. Enemies weren't supposed to have fathers, previous lives, or wistful expressions when they spoke of home. At midday, the guards distributed lunch from metal containers that steamed in the cold air. Volkov expected thin soup and stale bread, siege rations designed to keep prisoners barely alive. Instead, he found himself staring at thick pea soup with visible chunks of pork, accompanied by fresh rye bread that reminded him painfully of his grandmother's baking in Tula. "Don't eat their food," Komarov hissed. "They're trying to make us dependent, grateful." But Volkov's body betrayed his ideology. The bread tasted like childhood memories. Sunday mornings in his grandmother's kitchen, the smell of yeast and caraway seeds mixing with wood smoke from the stove. His grandfather had been a hunter who taught him to read forest sounds, to feel for the heartbeat of hidden prey. That same grandfather had fought Germans in the First War and warned that fascists were devils in human skin. Yet the bread was real and warm and freely given. That afternoon, while splitting logs, Volkov noticed something that made his sniper's instincts prickle. Corporal Järvinen carried a photograph tucked inside his helmet liner. During a brief rest, when the guard thought no one was watching, he'd pulled it out and stared at it with an expression Volkov recognized. He'd worn that same look while reading letters from his wife during the siege of Leningrad. Evening brought another contradiction. The Finnish camp doctor, a grey-haired man with gentle hands, made rounds through the barracks, checking on prisoners' health. When he reached Volkov's bunk, he examined the sniper's hands with professional interest. "Frostbite scars," he observed in accented Russian. "You've been in the forest a long time, 18 months. And you shot well in those conditions?" The question seemed genuine, medical, rather than military. The doctor's fingers probed the nerve damage in Volkov's trigger finger with the careful touch of someone who understood the intersection of anatomy and marksmanship. "Cold aim," Volkov found himself saying. "I learned to shoot by sound and instinct when visibility failed." Remarkable adaptation. The human nervous system is quite capable of compensating for lost senses. That night, as snow continued to fall outside the barracks windows, Volkov lay awake, wondering whether adaptation was another word for betrayal. What happens to a soldier when his certainty begins to thaw like snow in spring? The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by a Red Cross courier who spoke 3 languages and treated prisoners like human beings rather than tactical assets. Volkov recognized his wife Katarina's handwriting immediately, the careful Cyrillic script she'd learned from a village priest during the literacy campaigns. His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal, and for a moment the sounds of Stalag 326 faded into the background whisper of wind through Karelian pines. "My dearest Alexei, we received word through official channels that you are missing, presumed captured near Medvezhegorsk. I choose to believe you are alive somewhere, reading these words. The siege conditions here in Leningrad have worsened since October. Little Mikhail asks for his papa every night. He found your old hunting rifle in the cellar and insists on cleaning it, just as you taught him. I don't have the heart to tell him it cannot bring you home. The rations have been cut again. 125 grams of bread daily for non-workers. I've been assigned to munitions factory duty, 12-hour shifts, 7 days weekly. The workers' bread ration is larger, but my hands shake constantly now from the chemicals. I try to save portions for Mikhail, but children need more than I can provide. If you are alive, if you are reading this, please know that we believe you are fighting to return to us. The party officials visited last week to remind us that Soviet soldiers do not surrender. They spoke of the duty of soldiers' families to maintain faith in victory. I assured them of my loyalty. But Alexei, late at night when Mikhail is sleeping and the artillery is quiet, I sometimes wonder if being alive somewhere might matter more than being heroically dead here. Do not think me weak for writing this. Come home to us, however you must. Your loving wife, Katerina. The letter trembled in Volkov's hands as he read it twice, 3 times, memorizing every word. Around him, the barracks had fallen silent. Other prisoners were reading their own mail, and the collective weight of distant sorrow filled the space like smoke. Sergeant Komarov appeared at his shoulder, his political officer's instincts alert to signs of ideological wavering. Bad news from home? My wife, my son. The siege continues. The siege will be broken. Soviet strength will triumph. Our sacrifice here means nothing if we lose faith in ultimate victory. Volkov folded the letter carefully, placing it inside his jacket near his heart. Through the window, he could see Finnish guards changing shifts with the same tired routine he'd observed for weeks. Corporal Järvinen was heading home for his day off, probably to see his own family, to hold his own children. That afternoon's work detail felt different. Every swing of the axe reminded Volkov of the wood-splitting chores he'd done with young Mikhail, teaching his son the proper stance and follow-through. The boy would be 7 now, old enough to understand that Papa might not come home, old enough to take on adult responsibilities in a starving city. You're distracted today, Corporal Järvinen observed during the midday break. Trouble sleeping? Volkov studied the Finnish guard's face, noting the genuine concern in his expression. In the Karelian forest, this man might have been in his crosshairs, just another target disappearing in the fog. Now he was asking after a prisoner's well-being. I received a letter from my wife, from Leningrad. Järvinen's expression grew troubled. Both men knew the rumors about conditions in the besieged city. How old is your son? The question should have been a violation of protocol. Prisoners weren't supposed to discuss personal details with guards. Guards weren't supposed to care about prisoners' families, yet the words came easily. 7. He wants to be a hunter like his father. Järvinen reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph Volkov had glimpsed earlier. It showed 2 young children, a boy and a girl, standing in front of a farmhouse with a woman who shared Järvinen's gentle eyes. My son is 8. My daughter is 5. The boy helps his mother with the farm work now. They stood in silence for a moment. 2 fathers who had been shooting at each other's countries for over a year, united by the universal fear of leaving children fatherless. That evening, the camp doctor made his usual rounds. When he reached Volkov's bunk, he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Vitamins, he explained, for the malnutrition symptoms. I noticed tremors in your hands during yesterday's examination. Inside the package were military vitamin tablets, but also a small piece of dark chocolate. Real chocolate, not the ersatz confections that had disappeared from Soviet cities years ago. The doctor's eyes met Volkov's with quiet understanding. Sometimes the spirit needs nourishment as much as the body. That night, Volkov broke the chocolate into tiny pieces, letting each fragment dissolve slowly on his tongue while he reread Katerina's letter. The sweetness seemed almost criminal in its richness, a luxury that his starving family couldn't dream of tasting. Yet he couldn't bring himself to refuse this small mercy. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Can a man's love for his family coexist with gratitude toward his enemies? December brought the first serious test of Volkov's resolve, delivered not through torture or intimidation, but through a medical emergency that began with the sound he'd dreaded since capture, the distant echo of rifle fire, not his Mosin-Nagant, but the sharp crack of Finnish service rifles conducting target practice beyond the camp perimeter. The sound transported him back to that fog-shrouded morning near Medvezhegorsk, to the last time his own weapon had spoken with authority in the mist. The crisis arrived during the third week of the month, when young Private Vasily Petrov, the same 19-year-old who'd urged retreat through the fog, collapsed during evening roll call. The boy, who'd been soft around the edges despite 6 months at the front, had developed pneumonia, his lungs filling with fluid as his body finally succumbed to the accumulated stress of combat, capture, and exile. Camp Dr. Eriki Laxo worked through the night, treating Petrov in the infirmary, while Volkov and the other prisoners waited for news. The old physician moved with the precise economy of someone who'd spent decades fighting death in all its forms, first as a civilian doctor in rural Finland, then as a military surgeon trying to save young men who'd been torn apart by a war none of them had chosen. "He needs sulfur drugs," Dr. Laxo explained to Volkov during a brief break. "Antibiotics that could save his life. But medical supplies are limited even for our own wounded." The implication hung in the cold air between them. Resources were finite. Choices had to be made. Enemy prisoners might not receive the same level of care as Finnish soldiers. Sergeant Komarov, despite his rigid political orthodoxy, had grown protective of Petrov during their weeks in captivity. The boy reminded him of his younger brother, another casualty of the war's relentless appetite for youth. "They'll let him die," Komarov whispered bitterly. "One less Soviet soldier to worry about. This is what their mercy looks like when it costs them something." But the next morning brought a surprise that challenged every assumption about enemy behavior. Dr. Laxo appeared in the barracks carrying a canvas bag filled with medical supplies. Not just the basic medications allocated for prisoner care, but premium sulfur drugs from his personal reserve, antibiotics he'd been saving for Finnish casualties. "Why?" Volkov asked, unable to reconcile this action with any military logic. "Doctor." Laxo paused, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. "Because he's 19 years old, and his mother probably wrote him letters about coming home safely, just like the mothers of our Finnish boys. Because medical training teaches you to see patients, not enemies. Because some things matter more than politics." The treatment began immediately. For 3 days, Dr. Laxo monitored Petrov's condition with the same attention he would have given his own son. Corporal Jervinen contributed personal items, extra blankets from his own quarters, soup prepared by his wife and smuggled into the camp against regulations. On the 4th day, Petrov's fever broke. The young private who'd wanted to retreat through the fog would live to see another spring. That evening, Volkov found himself in the infirmary, ostensibly helping with basic medical tasks, but actually trying to understand the doctor's motivations. The elderly Finn worked in comfortable silence, cleaning instruments and preparing medications with the ritual precision of a priest performing sacred duties. "In the forest," Volkov said finally, "I shot men I couldn't see. Called it cold aim. Never thought about their mothers writing letters." Dr. Laxo continued his work without responding immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent treating war's casualties. "War makes killers of healers and healers of killers. Your shooting skills adapted for blindness, they show the same human ingenuity I use to save lives, different applications of the same desperate innovation. But I was the Nebelgeist. I appeared from nowhere, took impossible shots, vanished before they could find me. I was death in the fog. And now you're a man helping me save a boy's life." People contain multitudes, Sergeant. The capacity for destruction and mercy often reside in the same hands. Through the infirmary window, snow was falling on the camp again, each flake illuminated briefly in the searchlight beams before disappearing into darkness. Volkov watched the light and shadow play across the compound, remembering how he'd learned to read similar patterns in the Karelian forest. How darkness and visibility were often matters of perspective rather than absolute conditions. Doctor, Laxo handed him a piece of dark chocolate, the same type he'd received weeks earlier, but this time offered as payment for assistance rather than charity. Keep this, Volkov said, pushing it back. Give it to Petrov when he's stronger. Young men heal faster when they remember what sweetness tastes like. The doctor's smile was barely visible in the dim infirmary light, but his nod carried acknowledgement of something that transcended nationality, ideology, and the arbitrary boundaries drawn by politicians and generals. How many acts of unexpected mercy can a soldier's conscience absorb before it changes who he is? The revelation came hidden inside a routine medical examination, wrapped in the familiar sound that had haunted Volkov since capture, the metallic click of precision engineering. Not his lost Mosin-Nagant, but Dr. Laxo's stethoscope mechanism as the physician checked his heartbeat and found something unexpected. 3 months into his captivity at Stalag 326, the fog ghost discovered that his enemies had been keeping secrets, but not the kind he'd expected. Your medical records indicate severe malnutrition prior to capture, Dr. Laxo observed, reviewing files spread across his desk like tactical maps. Chronic vitamin deficiency, muscle wastage, signs of prolonged starvation. These conditions didn't develop during your weeks here. Volkov shifted uncomfortably on the examination table. The doctor's clinical assessment felt more invasive than any interrogation. The siege of Leningrad. Rations were limited. According to the Red Cross reports we've received, Soviet forces near Lake Onega have been operating on subsistence rations for over 6 months. Your sniper effectiveness during that period suggests remarkable adaptation to physical degradation. The words hung in the air like morning mist, slowly revealing a landscape Volkov hadn't wanted to examine. Dr. Laxo opened a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder marked with Red Cross seals, not Finnish military intelligence, but humanitarian documentation that painted a picture of the war's human cost. We've been tracking nutritional data on Soviet prisoners since 1941, the doctor continued. Not for military advantage, but for medical treatment protocols. What we've discovered is troubling. The folder contained photographs, medical charts, and correspondence that told a story of systematic starvation masquerading as military necessity. Average weight loss among captured Soviet soldiers, 30%. Documented cases of scurvy, rickets, and neurological damage from prolonged malnutrition. Evidence that the fog ghost's legendary skills had been partially the product of a body and mind pushed beyond normal limits by hunger. Your cold aim technique, Dr. Laxo said gently, it likely developed because malnutrition affects visual processing. Your brain compensated for compromised eyesight by enhancing auditory and tactical sensitivity. You became a better sniper partly because you were starving. The revelation struck Volkov like a rifle round to the chest. 18 months of being der Nebelgeist, of taking impossible shots through dense fog, of vanishing like a ghost in the Karelian forest. All of it built on a foundation of deprivation that Soviet command had never acknowledged, never addressed, never even admitted existed. They knew, he whispered. Command knew what was happening to us. Dr. Laxo's expression grew pained. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth, a piece of dark chocolate, but not the medical chocolate he'd been distributing. This was Finnish military ration chocolate, dense with calories and nutrients, the kind of field ration that Volkov's unit had never received. Finnish soldiers carry these during winter operations, the doctor explained. Each bar contains enough concentrated nutrition to sustain a man for 6 hours of combat. We've been developing improved field rations since 1940, specifically to prevent the malnutrition we observed in Soviet prisoners. Volkov took the chocolate bar with trembling hands. The wrapper bore Finnish military markings and production dates, evidence that enemy forces had been better fed, better supplied, better cared for than the Red Army units they'd been fighting near Medvedjugorsk. While he'd been perfecting techniques to compensate for starvation, Finnish snipers had been operating at full strength. Why are you showing me this? Because you asked me once why we treat prisoners humanely. The answer is partly medical. Malnutrition makes people more susceptible to disease, and disease spreads regardless of nationality. But it's also moral. We've seen what hunger does to human judgment, to the capacity for rational thought. We refuse to use starvation as a weapon. That evening, Volkov sat in the barracks staring at the chocolate bar while snow fell outside the windows. Around him, other prisoners were writing letters home or reading books from the camp library, activities that seemed absurd now that he understood the true nature of their situation. They weren't prisoners of war in any conventional sense. They were refugees from a military system that had sacrificed their health for tactical advantage. Sergeant Komarov approached with his usual political officer's instinct for ideological crisis. "You look troubled, comrade. Bad news from the doctor?" Volkov considered sharing his discovery, then realized the futility. Komarov's worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that Soviet command had systematically destroyed their soldiers' health, while enemy forces had maintained humane standards. The truth would destroy him. "Just thinking about home," Volkov lied. "Good. Remember your duty to the motherland. Remember that our sacrifice here serves the greater cause." After Komarov moved away, Volkov carefully broke the chocolate bar into sections. Each piece dissolved on his tongue with a richness that seemed almost criminal after months of deprivation. But with each bite came the bitter realization that this luxury, this basic nutritional requirement, had been available to Finnish soldiers throughout the entire campaign, while Soviet forces slowly starved. "Doctor." Laxo appeared at his elbow, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of someone who understood the moral weight of revelation. "Knowledge is a burden, Sergeant. Once you understand the true cost of what happened to you, you can never unknow it." "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Survive it, carry it home, decide whether the truth serves anyone's cause or whether some burdens are meant to be carried in silence." The old doctor's words echoed in Volkov's mind as he finished the chocolate, tasting sweetness and bitterness in equal measure. What does a soldier owe to the truth when the truth could destroy everything he believed he was fighting for? The repatriation train arrived on a March morning in 1943, its locomotive breathing steam into air that still carried the bite of Finnish winter. Volkov stood at the platform with 43 other Soviet prisoners, each man carrying a small bundle of personal effects and a much larger weight of unspoken truths. In his jacket pocket, wrapped carefully in cloth, he carried the last piece of Finnish military chocolate Dr. Laxo had given him, not as sustenance, but as evidence of a moral complexity that defied every simple story about the war. The sound that had haunted his dreams for months, the phantom click of his lost Mosin-Nagant's bolt, had finally been replaced by a different mechanical precision. The steady rhythm of train wheels carrying him back toward a homeland that might no longer recognize the man he'd become. Private Petrov, fully recovered from his pneumonia, stood beside him, clutching a letter of medical commendation that Dr. Laxo had written for his records. The 19-year-old who'd wanted to retreat through the fog had learned something about the difference between survival and victory, though neither of them could articulate exactly what that knowledge meant. Sergeant Komarov maintained his rigid bearing, the political officer's certainty apparently unshaken by 5 months of humane treatment at enemy hands. He'd spent the final weeks organizing ideological discussions among the prisoners, preparing them for the inevitable debriefing that would follow their return to Soviet control. "Remember," he told the assembled group, "we have witnessed the enemy's attempts at psychological warfare. Their kindness was a weapon designed to weaken our resolve. When we report to command, we must emphasize our resistance to their manipulation tactics." But as the train pulled away from Stalag 326, Volkov found himself looking back at the compound where Corporal Järvinen stood watching their departure. The Finnish guard raised one hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or benediction, and Volkov realized he would carry that image for the rest of his life. An enemy who'd shown him photographs of his children, who'd shared his wife's cooking, who'd treated prisoners like human beings deserving of dignity. The journey south took 3 days, with stops at exchange points where Soviet and Finnish officials conducted the bureaucratic rituals of prisoner transfer. At each station, Volkov noticed the deteriorating condition of the facilities, the increasingly haggard appearance of Soviet personnel, the subtle signs that the war was extracting a terrible price from his homeland. When they finally crossed into Soviet territory, the contrast became stark. Guards who searched the returning prisoners were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their uniforms patched and repatched, their weapons showing signs of inadequate maintenance. The bread they were offered as a welcome-home meal was grey and gritty, nothing like the rye loaves that had been standard fare at the Finnish camp. The debriefing took place in a concrete building that smelled of disinfectant and fear. NKVD officers questioned each prisoner individually, their interest focused primarily on intelligence gathered during captivity and evidence of collaboration with the enemy. When Volkov's turn came, he faced a major whose uniform bore the decorations of a decorated veteran, but whose eyes held the desperate hunger Volkov had learned to recognize during the siege of Leningrad. "Senior Sergeant Volkov, your reputation as a sniper preceded your capture. The enemy must have been very interested in your techniques. They asked about my methods, Comrade Major. I provided only name, rank, and service number." "Excellent. And their treatment of prisoners? We have reports that they attempt to undermine ideological commitment through false kindness." Volkov hesitated, the weight of Dr. Laxo's chocolate heavy in his pocket. He thought of young Petrov's life, saved by enemy medical care, of Finnish guards sharing family photographs, of meals that contained actual nutrition rather than sawdust substitutes. "They followed Geneva Convention protocols," he said finally. "Adequate food, medical care, work assignments consistent with international law." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The truth was that enemies had shown him more mercy than his own command had provided, that starvation tactics had nearly destroyed his health, while enemy forces maintained humane standards, that the moral universe he'd inhabited for 32 years had been quietly turned inside out by small acts of kindness from people he'd been taught to hate. The major made notes on his report and dismissed him with instructions to report for reassignment within the week. That evening, in a temporary barracks that housed returning prisoners, Volkov wrote his first letter home to Katerina. He told her he was alive, healthy, and eager to return to their family. He described his capture near Medvezhegorsk and his subsequent imprisonment in general terms that would pass censorship. He did not mention the chocolate, the photographs shared by enemy guards, or the doctor who'd saved Petrov's life with medicine meant for Finnish soldiers. Some truths, he realized, were too dangerous for correspondence, too complex for official reports, too heavy for anyone to carry except the men who'd lived them. 40 years later, in 1983, retired Colonel Alexei Volkov would sit in his Moscow apartment and finally unwrap that last piece of Finnish chocolate. It had long since turned white with age, its sweetness transformed into something bitter and chalky. But as it dissolved on his tongue, he would remember Dr. Laxo's gentle hands, Corporal Järvinen's photograph, and the moral weight of enemies who'd insisted on remaining human. His granddaughter visiting for his birthday would find him staring out the window with tears in his eyes. "What's wrong, grandfather?" "Nothing, child. I was just remembering the taste of something I should have forgotten long ago." The Mosin-Nagant mounted above his fireplace, a replacement for the rifle lost in that October fog, would catch the afternoon light, its barrel gleaming like winter death. But in his memory, the sound of its bolt action had been permanently replaced by something quieter, the whispered click of precision engineering, the sound of human kindness operating with mechanical reliability even in the depths of war. Some weapons, he'd learned, were harder to surrender than others. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What's heavier to carry through life, the memory of hatred or the memory of unexpected mercy?